Something that is often overlooked regarding this whole story involving UFOs and strange animal mutilations is the obscure history of the various labs, agencies, and defense contractors working with experimental material and conducting covert operations near the majority of sightings and chaotic scenes. One overarching factor that binds those involved, like the original Atomic Energy Commission, an agency that would later transition to the Department of Energy, along with the Los Alamos Labs, Sandia Labs, Phillips Lab, the Air Force Special Weapons Lab, the Environmental Protection Agency, Kirtland Air Force Base, Area 51, Dugway Proving Ground, the CIA, and the NSA, are the major roles that all of these entities played throughout the 1940s while the country was developing nuclear weapons and technology, such as the atom bombs built and appropriately named Little Boy and Fat Man during the Manhattan Project. It was the country's last-ditch effort to end World War II on the Pacific Front. Well, that's at least what we were all taught to believe to morally justify their construction and deployment in Japan. Aside from nuclear bombs, it's important to also recognize the continuous connections of these national laboratories to Native American reservations. If anyone is familiar with similar yet equally bizarre stories at Skinwalker Ranch, then they're probably aware that it lies next to a Native American reservation as well. Interestingly, Robert Bigelow is directly tied to this part of the story as he bought the ranch in 1996 and only sold it in 2016, well after the NIDS disbanded in 2004. If anyone is interested in a video about this portion of the story, then please let me know, as there are many completely different stories that originate from the ranch, which pose more compelling questions about our world and what we typically consider as science fiction. A comprehensive look at the NIDS's involvement and ownership of the ranch can be observed in Colm A. Keller and George Knapp's books, Hunt for the Skinwalker and Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. To extend myself further on a previous point, if you expand your perspective regarding the region, then you'll also find that the Dugway Proving Ground is located within a feasible distance to Skinwalker Ranch, once again near a Native American reservation. The reservation close to Dugway Proving Ground happens to be called Skull Valley Reservation. This historical testing facility has been running experiments and covert operations for the U.S. Army and Department of Defense since 1942. Specifically, though, this facility oversaw the testing and evaluation of chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear defense equipment and capabilities for the military. Before I began researching anything for this video, I really didn't know much of what Los Alamos did aside from some brief knowledge of their nuclear technology research and their association with Bob Lazar's story. Lazar claimed to have worked there before being selected to work at Area 51, but more precisely, S4, during the 1980s. Even though Los Alamos Labs is publicly known for their work in nuclear technology, many people are not aware of their involvement in alternative avenues of research. So let's discuss a historical fragment of their non-nuclear programs. Not many people know that the labs had lost a lawsuit where the Los Alamos Medical Center was caught secretly taking tissue samples of over 300 deceased residents in the northern New Mexico area to test dead tissue for radiation contamination. Thankfully, a pathologist, Dr. Michael W. Stewart, worked at the hospital during these tests that spanned over the Cold War era and agreed to pay the families financial retribution on behalf of the deceased test subjects in 2007. Stewart, along with other more heartless and cold individuals like Dr. Clarence Lushbaugh, were supposedly involved in a program called the Los Alamos Human Tissue Analysis Program at the hospital, in which tissue samples from brains, livers, hearts, and other organs were unknowingly taken for radiation testing. Obviously, the families who signed the autopsy release forms were not told whatsoever about the government studies on radiation, or at the very least, they were severely misinformed of what would happen to their deceased loved ones as they were signing the official documents. In 1996, for instance, relatives of Cecil Kelly, a former lab employee, had filed a lawsuit against the pathologist who conducted Kelly's autopsy, with that individual being Dr. Lushbaugh. According to open source reports, among the various organs harvested, Dr. Lushbaugh had allegedly removed Cecil's brain along with the deceased's entire nervous system. These relatives had also alleged the misconduct of other doctors, the medical center, and the administration of Los Alamos in removing the organs from deceased people without obtaining consent from next of kin. According to public information gained from the lawsuit, Los Alamos had been ostensibly conducting radiation experiments from 1958 all the way to 1980. During a deposition for the case, he was asked who gave him the authority to remove 8 pounds of organs and tissue from Cecil Kelly's body. Dr. Lushbaugh simply replied with the response that, "God gave me permission." This kind of response from people like Lushbaugh reminds me of the times during the Middle Ages when tyrannical kings and queens of empires used God as their scapegoat to wrongfully justify their positions of authority and abusive actions. The term commonly used for people with this delusional and blasphemous perspective was that they believed that they were given the divine right to hold their tangible abusive power. Even though none of the defendants on trial had admitted to any wrongdoing, when the case had been settled on part of the Los Alamos Medical Center, the labs had to acknowledge that, quote, express consent to use the autopsy tissue may not have been obtained from next of kin, end quote. When delving deeper into some of the histories of these men involved, you'll likely find that individuals such as Dr. Lushbaugh had assisted in the development of chemotherapy drugs that are still being used today at cancer treatment centers. Evidently, Dr. Lushbaugh had mainly committed himself to studying the lymph node system and had additionally conducted research and projects that involved nitrogen and sulfur mustards. Other germ warfare tests and various nerve agents were conducted during this time too at locations like the Dugway Proving Ground, so you're aware. China Lake was another facility that was called the Naval Air Weapons Station and is based in California. Although the China Lake facility may not have been researching the same weapons as those at the DPG, there are many overlaps which occur across practically every secretive military testing facility in the country. Regardless of whether the US Navy, Army, Air Force, CIA, or NASA has control of it, everyone has their hands in the same pie. Nevertheless, I'm sure you can understand why so many families had been outraged about what the Los Alamos Medical Center did during their seemingly countless autopsies. You should know that according to a 2001 to 2005 study, it was indicated that the state of New Mexico was the second in the nation for growing cases of thyroid cancer. Even more curiously though, it was said in the study that Los Alamos County in particular was one of the leading counties in the nation for thyroid cancer. Just more food for thought, I suppose. In summation, this case involving Dr. Lushbaugh became emblematic of how institutional science can bypass ethics under the guise of progress. Remember that. Separate from the national laboratories in the United States is the Department of Energy. When it began as the Atomic Energy Commission in 1947, the agency had funded a myriad of grandiose projects to advance the nation's knowledge and technical capabilities in nuclear energy. But unfortunately, nearly all of its efforts would be buried deeply in classified files and not see the light of day until the 21st century. This was mainly due to the escalating and continuous tensions between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Even so, the DOE has had long-standing ties with military branches like the US Air Force and Army to work on experimental programs such as Project NEPA. This aircraft nuclear propulsion program was initiated in 1946 by the US Army Air Forces, and it aimed to develop some kind of nuclear propulsion system for future manned aircraft. In 1951, Project NEPA was transferred to the Atomic Energy Commission and was allegedly canceled in 1961 due to hefty financial constraints tied to the project. The US Air Force had pursued 2 different systems for nuclear-powered jet engines: the direct air cycle concept and the indirect air cycle concept. It was purported that the direct air cycle concept was developed by General Electric, while the indirect air cycle configuration was developed by Pratt & Whitney. The DOE can start to be more visibly tied to this story when people realize that it oversees all the nuclear weapons that are stored at Kirtland Air Force Base, or at least it did during the 20th century. By now, dots should start to connect in your head about what's been really happening in the US. Stepping away from the subject of nuclear-propelled aircraft, the DOE has also been involved in other literal groundbreaking projects that involve nuclear technology, such as Project Plowshare. Now, as much as I would like to delve as deep as I could into this particular subject, I decided to leave the majority of the discussion for another video in the near future. In that video, I'll appropriately break down the history in the United States where a plethora of federal agencies, military branches, national laboratories, and various companies had worked together to exhaust all of their options of potential beneficial applications of nuclear technology. But as it pertains to this video and story, it would be a disservice to you as the viewer to not at least discuss one nuclear test from Project Plowshare. However, in order to do that, I will have to at least briefly introduce the project to you. Project Plowshare was designed by the Atomic Energy Commission to find peaceful and controlled uses for nuclear explosions. These peaceful nuclear explosions, or P&Es for short, were carried out with seemingly countless of proposals to test if these controlled explosions would aid in things like fracking, connecting inland river systems, conversion of salt to steam energy, the creation of underground caverns for natural resource storage, the construction of artificial ports along the coast or highways through mountainous terrain, and a litany of other things that would be better to discuss more in depth during another video. Many of these experimental nuclear explosions were conducted at the Nevada test site to research different devices and blasting techniques. The project had acquired its name from Micah 4:3 of the Holy Bible, where it states, "And he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." Although I see why the Atomic Energy Commission decided to name the secret program Project Plowshare, I don't think that nuclear weapons fit the comparison that the Bible made with nations turning their battle-ready swords into constructive farming tools used to plow fields to grow healthy crops. A key distinction that makes the comparison inappropriate, at least in my view, is that it is unavoidable to deal with the radiological consequences of these nuclear explosions, regardless of whether or not they are considered peaceful. It's not as simple as repurposing bombs meant to decimate life as well as infrastructure on the largest of scales, and just turning them into nuclear blasting devices that are meant to aid in humanity's development. Overall, during the course of the entire project spanning multiple decades, 27 nuclear blasts would be approved by the Atomic Energy Commission and were conducted while having the assistance of different companies and national laboratories like Los Alamos. Of course, many long-term negative repercussions unfolded as a result of these tests, such as blighted land, radioactivity, tritium-contaminated water, fallout from various kinds of nuclear debris that were dispersed into the atmosphere. After the public had caught wind of what was happening, both figuratively and literally speaking, people began protesting in the affected towns near the detonation sites, and the program was quickly terminated in 1977. As I mentioned previously, it wouldn't be appropriate to tell this Dulce story without the inclusion of at least one explosion conducted during the program: the gas buggy incident. The explosion took place on December 10th, 1967, in a rural area of northern New Mexico that was part of the Carson National Forest and was approximately 25 miles southwest of the town of Dulce, according to authors like Greg Valdez. The Lawrence Radiation Laboratory, along with the El Paso Natural Gas Company, were mainly the two entities who took an interest for this particular test. Gas Buggy's purpose was to see if controlled nuclear detonations could be beneficial in breaking up rock formations as seen in techniques like traditional fracking, and supply an easier way to extract natural gas from hard-to-reach places. The gas company had chosen this area as the desired location because it was known that there were large natural gas deposits beneath layers of sandstone under Leandro Canyon. It was just a matter of the DOE funding the project to get things rolling. The test consisted of placing a 29 kiloton nuclear device at a depth of over 4,200 feet below the surface. For comparison, the atomic bombs used in World War II held an explosion yield of approximately 15 kilotons of TNT. After detonating the device underground, the explosion had created an 80-foot wide and 335-foot deep crater at the test site. Even though everything seemingly went according to plan and the natural gas was able to be tapped and extracted, unfortunately, the gas had proven to be excessively radioactive and was nowhere near safe to be commercially viable. To combat this issue of the contaminated natural gas, the DOE had come up with the bright idea of flaring off the natural gas by burning it into the atmosphere instead of sealing off the cavity and keeping everything underground. Over the course of several years, a total of 295 million cubic feet of contaminated natural gas had been burned off at the surface, taking the radioactive fallout downwind to other nearby cities and livestock ranches. After burning off that amount of gas and releasing large amounts of radioactive tritium along with other radioactive isotopes like krypton-85 and iodine-131 into the atmosphere, you would think that that would be the worst of the gas buggy incident, but it's not. Along with the radioactive air, the project also had a radioactive leak that wasn't detected until 2003, 36 years after the actual gas buggy explosion. Field investigations conducted by the Desert Research Institute had found tritium-contaminated water in one of the wells attached to a larger nearby aquifer. Despite the fact that the investigation had found the tritium leak at around 1,800 feet below the ground, no one was ever able to definitively determine the source of it, and the well bore tied to the leak was officially plugged and left abandoned. Today, the site and its surrounding area is now safe. However, any commercial digging or drilling is strictly prohibited in order to contain any and all buried radioactive material. By extension to the exhaustive attempts of Project Plowshare and other nuclear experiments conducted during the Cold War, in 1955, the Atomic Energy Commission would establish an adjacent program to Plowshare to investigate numerous claims of injury and death to ranchers' livestock, along with other forms of domesticated animals that were thought to be caused by the nuclear tests conducted. Initially, the DOE and Environmental Protection Agency were only concerned with the consequences of nuclear fallout within the region of the Nevada Proving Grounds established in 1950. To draw another underlying connection, the Nevada Proving Grounds would later be renamed to the Nevada Test Site in 1955. The program that the DOE and EPA were interested in had developed into what we now know as the Animal Investigation Program, or the AIP. Yet the program wouldn't really get off the ground until 1957. This was when the program had finally bought a herd of beef cattle to begin the research. The test itself consisted of allowing the cattle to graze on the irradiated lands of the NTS for over 2 decades to see what the consequences would be if the animals lived directly in nuclear contaminated sites for extended amounts of time. Although these cattle and other forms of wildlife were regularly tested, even through the decades of escalating cattle mutilations, practically no one knew of the AIP and what government veterinarians were doing until a report was released in 1984 by the EPA that discussed portions of it. The important thing to take away from this program and document released was its discussion of many explicit studies and other herds that wasn't the original herd being studied at the NTS. Notably, one of the specific studies conducted outside of the state of Nevada was in relation to the gas buggy incident in northern New Mexico, where multiple samples were taken from local beef cattle herds to test for radiological contamination. Again, these were local herds of livestock that weren't originally part of the study, and they were owned by private citizens like the Gomez family. They were not owned nor raised by the US government, yet because of the herd's long-standing presence within these areas of potential nuclear contamination, the various privately owned herds of livestock around the country had made perfect test subjects to sample tissue from. Allegedly, these off-site radiological safe nuclear studies on livestock were initially conducted by the US Army. Army veterinarian officers were in charge of the whole project all the way up until 1964, when the program was transferred to the United States Public Health Systems Agency. The AIP was lastly transferred to the EPA in 1970, and it is reported that samples from the herds of cattle are still being discreetly analyzed by the agency today. That should tell you something about the severity of what was found in these radiological studies. Before we move on to the next part of this story, I felt that it would be inappropriate to leave out other highly secretive projects associated with the AIP and Atomic Energy Commission. The Army Chemical Corps and the Atomic Energy Commission had also managed a substantial amount of experiments into radiological and chemical warfare tactics at the Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah, for instance. In 1968, it was reported that over 6,400 sheep had all keeled over and quickly died as they were grazing in the fields near the DPG. Apparently, there was an aerial chemical test conducted nearby that sprayed 300 gallons of a highly toxic nerve agent called VX into the air by a jet that was passing over a chemical compound. It was additionally purported that the radiological experiments at the DPG had involved utilizing radiation to destroy various crops. Stepping back to 1954, the Department of Defense and the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project had secretly put together what they referred to as a fallout study group for the Operation Teapot tests that were planned to be conducted the following year. These tests consisted of entities like the National Institute of Health and the Walter Reed Army Institute for Research to collect human urine and animal milk along with animal tissue samples after the tests of Operation Teapot were completed. According to a memorandum from the chief of the AFSWP, he exclaimed that the biological material collected must be discreetly handled and ultimately kept secret. Allegedly, the samples were instructed to be collected by researchers for the purposes of nutritional studies, whatever that means. It is unlikely that we will receive further information from the government about all this radioactivity research and tissue sample collection, since getting too deep into disclosure could easily start implicating people within so many government agencies, military branches, national laboratories, and a slew of companies in matters of mysterious subjects like the cattle mutilations. If any of you are interested in me discussing more thoroughly about the various clandestine radioactive studies conducted throughout the 20th century, then don't worry. I intend on covering the subject more in a future video later this year to further explain the complex and dense web that forms this overarching nuclear story within the United States. I would like to particularly focus on the human and animal-related experiments that were being conducted during the Cold War as a response to the growing fears of cancer rates caused by nuclear technology and its fallout. I just need to finish reading The Plutonium Files by Eileen Welsom, and perhaps make a video on something else entirely before I really start planning out the next video related to all of this. So much of the declassified information that Eileen Wellsome covers wraps back around to this particular portion of the story. But I assure you that there's already plenty of radioactive information shared in this video that should provide you with a good foundation of what was really happening behind the scenes of American nuclear research.
Deedle-dum-dum, deedle-dum-dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and cover, ducked and cover.
He did what we all must learn to do.
You and you
And you
and you, duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover.
This is an official civil defense film produced in cooperation with the Federal Civil Defense Administration and in consultation with the Safety Commission of the National Education Association.
Produced by Archer Productions.